sharp life. Alright.
Hello, welcome to Shop Talk with Bob. This is episode number 4. And this is going to be the first of 4 deep dives that we're going to do into grinding. Grinding has been a subject that a lot of people have been asking about. It's a very broad subject. It's got a lot of information. We're going to break it into 3 deep dives. The first one today, I'll be talking about abrasives and some of the machinery that we use. The second deep dive will be on laying out the blade and grinding with my fixtures. A lot of people have asked about that. And the third one will be grinding without fixtures, not exactly freehand, but with some aids and some dust control and a few other little things that are my preferences when I'm grinding a blade. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's start off with grit, true grit, any kind of grit. The grit is the size of the abrasive that we use on our belts. And it's graded using a 1-inch mesh, and the grade refers to the number of spaces in one direction and the other direction. So 60 by 60 gives you a 60 grit belt with 60 grit abrasive. 80 spaces by 80 spaces gives you 80 grit. There are other systems for measuring. When they use diamond belts, for example, it's a micron system, and Trizac belts and Norak belts by Norton use a completely different system, an A and an X system. But basically, most of the belts that we use in knife making are graded with the mesh system. Now, one thing I want to mention that a lot of people don't realize, 60 grit is probably the most common that people use for hogging or rough grinding, getting rid of as much material quickly as possible. And it's a very fast grit to use. However, I prefer the 80 grit, and I'm going to tell you why. 60 grit, remember, measured in 60 by 60, gives you the number of spaces, 3,600 spaces per square inch. Okay. 80 grit, which doesn't sound that much smaller actually than 60 grit, gives you 6,400 spaces per square inch, roughly half the size. So if you're rough grinding with 60 grit, your grit is going to be twice the size, which means the scratches are going to be twice as wide and twice as deep. And it's going to take you a lot longer to get rid of those scratches as you go down to finer and finer grits. I hope everybody has your notepad with you, because I'm going to be using mine. I don't want to forget anything here. What I prefer is the 80 grit, as I mentioned. And for certain steels like CPM 154, which is one of my favorite steels, I found that on the contact wheel, not on the platen, but on the contact wheel, which is 90 durometer rubber, I'm able to go from 80 grit down to an A16 Trizac belt, which is about 1200 grit. And I can do that in one step. A lot of people don't believe me. But can you get into this, Adam? Can we see that? This was ground with 80 grit, and immediately I went to the A16, and the front end is polished. And that's basically the reason why I like to start with 80 grit rather than with 60 grit. Okay. Excuse me. And as I said, there are some finishing belts which are differently graded. These are Trizac belts, and they're sometimes called engineered belts or formed belts. The abrasive is embedded in resins, and that tends to cushion the abrasive a little bit. Gives you a little bit of a little softer finish. And I use these for finishing.
Thank you.
Did I just change that?
No.
There we go. Okay? Very good. Now, separate systems. We're going to go over to the grinders, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the machinery and the equipment that I use for grinding almost all of my blades.